Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Conference Chair, Professor Dr. Rizwan Bashir, a Vice Chancellor, Major General Shehzad Sikandar, a Chief Guest, Rear Admiral Dr. Nasser Ikram, Dr. Noman Majid, the Dean, Social and Management Sciences, Lahore Garrison University, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. We begin with Allah's blessed name. We praise Him and we glorify Him as He ought to be praised and glorified. And we pray for peace and for blessings on all His noble messengers, and in particular on the last of them all, the Blessed Prophet Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. I am grateful to the Lahore Garrison University and to the organizers for their kind invitation for me to address this first international conference on management and social sciences. Thank you also for allowing me to choose to address the subject of Pakistan, the way forward. Kindly permit me to begin with a brief introduction to my profile with which I attempt to address the topic. After studying philosophy at Karachi University and Islam at the Alimi Institute of Islamic Studies in Karachi, under the guidance of the distinguished Islamic scholar, philosopher and Sufi Sheikh, Maulana Dr. Muhammad Fadlur Rahman Ansari, I returned to my native Trinidad and Tobago in 1971 to pursue further studies in international relations at the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies, and then at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. I then worked as a Foreign Service officer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Trinidad and Tobago until I resigned my job. I resigned from my job in 1985 in order to devote my life exclusively to Islamic scholarship. The 10 years that I then spent in New York until 9/11 were very important years in which I was able to grow in understanding and insight into world affairs as well as the world of Islam. I attended and I participated in numerous international conferences from my base in New York. And I also traveled extensively in the United States and Canada while lecturing in dozens of universities, colleges, churches, synagogues, and temples, and interacting with priests and rabbis and scholars. I participated in interfaith conferences in the United States with galaxies of Christian priests and ministers and Jewish rabbis representing Christianity and Judaism, while I was sometimes the solitary voice for Islam. I even lectured once in a Jewish synagogue. I lectured to almost every Muslim community resident in North America and hailing from every corner of the world of Islam. I also conducted the Salatul Jummah and delivered the khutbah at the United Nations headquarters in Manhattan for 10 years continuously and profited immensely from interactions with diplomats and ambassadors from around the world. I left the United States after 9/11 and then I traveled continuously around the world since then. And I also devoted a considerable time to emerge as a writer with some 30 of my books already published and a few more are still on the way. I struggled during all those years to try to locate in the Quran an explanation of the reality of the world today. And it was that intellectual struggle which led me eventually to pioneer Islamic eschatology as a new branch of knowledge in Islam. Islamic eschatology is that branch of knowledge which examines from the Quran as well as from the Hadith, to the extent that the Hadith is harmonious with the Quran, which examines the reality of the world in the end time. We know that we are living in the end time when we witness the Jews returning to Jerusalem to reclaim it as their own, 2,000 years after Allah Most High had expelled them and banned their return, and then restoring a state of Israel in the Holy Land more than 2,000 years after it was destroyed by divine decree. My scholarly profile is one in which I recognize that the greatest gift I've ever received in my scholarly life was the methodology for study of the Quran which I received from my teacher, Maulana Dr. Ansari. I suspect that Dr. Iqbal was of some help to him in understanding that subject. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once prophesied. He said, and I quote him in Urdu, he said about his ummah, मेरी उम्मत बारिश जैसे, मैं ये नहीं जानता हूँ क्या पहले बारिश बेहतर या आखिरी. My ummah is like the rain. I don't know which shower is better, the first or the last. My view, this is my view. My view is that the last shower of scholarly rain in this ummah will come from this part of the world of Islam, Pakistan. And it will come from the scholarship of Iqbal and from his student and my teacher of blessed memory, Maulana Dr. Ansari. I learned from Suratul Kahf that the most learned of all men, who represents the model of scholarship in Akhirul Zaman, is he in whose scholarship knowledge that is externally acquired is harmoniously integrated with knowledge that is internally received. And finally, I learned that the river of knowledge flows at its own speed. With this brief introduction, we will now proceed to the topic of my address that I will deliver, inshallah, from the perspective of Islamic eschatology. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once spoke to his companion Mu'az ibn Jabal to give him the following timeline of events which will occur at the end of history. And the hadith is recorded in the Sunan of Abi Dawood. Umran Bayt al-Maqdis, Kharabu Yatrib. Kharabu Yatrib, Khuruj al-Malhama. Khuruj al-Malhama, Fathul Constantiniya. Fathul Constantiniya, Khuruj al-Dajjal. When Jerusalem is center stage, said the Prophet ﷺ, and Medina is in a state of desolation, the next event to occur would be the Malhama, or the Great War. And then would follow the conquest of Constantinople, and finally the emergence of Dajjal. We know from another prophecy that he prophesied that a great war will occur in which 99% of all combatants would be killed, and that the great war will be fought for a mountain of gold which would emerge from the river Euphrates. I have offered an interpretation and an analysis of this hadith, of this prophecy, a political, an economic, and a monetary interpretation, and it's done in several of my books and lectures. Suffice it to say that I hold a view which is shared by many around the world today, that mankind has now arrived at that moment in history which is the very eve of the Great War. The Great War would be a one-time event in history, and would be a war in which NATO and her clients would wage nuclear war on Russia and China. And it would be precisely because of a mountain of gold. May I pause to remind those in Pakistan who are asleep, I don't know how many they are, but to remind you that Turkey is not only a member state of NATO, but is also actively actively at work in trying to get all of the Turkish-speaking neighbors to also join NATO. Pakistan has never faced a more challenging moment in the entire tumultuous history of the state than this moment when it must prepare for that greatest of all wars and for its consequences. In my book entitled Jerusalem in the Quran, published in 2001, 20 years ago, I have explained from the perspective of Islamic eschatology a messianic view of the movement of history, a messianic view of the movement of history in which a Pax Britannica was designed to be replaced by a Pax Americana, so that the Great War would eventually make way for a Pax Judaica in which the State of Israel would attempt to rule the world. I could never have offered this threefold eschatological description and analysis of the movement of history had I not previously benefited as a student at the Alimia Institute of Islamic Studies in Karachi from a class in the philosophy of history, which was taught to me by the distinguished philosopher Dr. Burhan Ahmad Farooqi, who read for his doctorate in philosophy at Aligarh Muslim University at the same time with Dr. Ansari, under the guidance of that outstanding Muslim philosopher, Professor Dr. Sayyid Zafarul Hasan. If and when the Great War does take place, both Iran and Pakistan would find that Turkish membership in NATO poses a grave threat, since neither the government of Pakistan nor the government of Iran is likely to ever take up the subject with Turkey as vigorously as is required. It remains for the people of both countries to raise their voices loudly enough to force their governments to act on the subject. I now wish to direct attention to another matter which is even graver for Pakistan than Turkish membership in NATO, and it is that a Pax Judaica cannot permit any Muslim country to have the military means to pose a threat to Israel. And so while the West was content to allow Pakistan to remain a nuclear-armed state, and the West took no military action against Iran to ensure that Iran would not have the means to join the nuclear club if ever attacked. This will certainly change if and when Pax Judaica emerges. I expect that both countries will be attacked concomitantly with Russia and China. I expect that the attack on Pakistan will be designed to denuclearize the state and to then ensure that Pakistan could never again rise up to return as a threat to Israel. And therefore I expect that the attack on Pakistan will be used to attempt to break it up into bits and pieces, tukra. In addition to trying to convince Turkey to quit NATO membership, how else should Pakistanis prepare for the Great War, as well as for the expected attack on Pakistan? Here is our response. Pakistan has to embark on strategic initiatives which will seek to change the strategic environment in a manner which would make it more favorable. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ set a magnificent example in strategic initiatives which delivered to him precisely such change in his strategic environment. May we remind you that the founder of Pakistan was famous for his profile as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim fraternity. That profile, which has been carefully preserved by history, must have caused him considerable pain when he had to abandon what his heart desired in consequence of the negative conduct of the leaders of Hindu India. Despite that profile of the founder of Pakistan, the Muslims of the entire subcontinent have waited in vain from the day that Muslim Pakistan broke away from Hindu India more than 70 years ago. They waited in vain for a strategic initiative which would offer some hope for healing the wounds of separation and restoring some measure of fraternity in Hindu-Muslim relations. Instead, a warmongering Hindu government in India is having a field day in brainwashing the Hindu world with ever-increasing hatred for Muslim Pakistan, while Pakistan appears bereft of any initiative which would take the wind out of Modi's sails. Pakistan also has to establish with Orthodox Christian Russia the same kind of relationship it has intelligently built with China these last 50 years. The Quran has prophesied, listen carefully, the Quran has prophesied that the Christian people are destined to become closest in love and affection for Muslims. I hold the view that the end-time conquest of Constantinople, prophesied by Nabi Muhammad ﷺ, will open the way for Hagia Sophia to be returned to those to whom it rightfully belongs. And that in turn would result in the fulfillment of the divine prophecy. It should not be difficult for our audience to recognize that the Ertugrul, I hope that's the way it's pronounced, the Ertugrul drama series, which is now being broadcast with Zionist assistance and Zionist approval on television screens all over the world, constitutes a blatant and transparent attempt of indoctrination and brainwashing in favor of an Ottoman Empire which continuously oppressed precisely those Christians with bogus jihad for 600 years. Our discerning audience would also recognize that the betrayal of the Quran during the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the betrayal of the Quran in the Sultan's response of war to the plea for peace made by the Christian Emperor Constantine XI, both before the commencement of the war and during the war. While the war was in progress, this was a betrayal of the Quran. Allah Most High has commanded in Surah Al-Anfal, listen to the words of Allah. وَإِن جَحَنُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ هُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. But if they incline to peace, you must also incline to peace. But if they incline to peace, you must also incline to peace. And place your trust in Allah. Verily, He alone is all-hearing, all-knowing. Our audience will also recognize the Sultan's blatant violation of the command of the Quran, that the believers must fight if necessary. The believers must fight if necessary to protect churches, to protect cathedrals, to protect protect Jewish synagogues, to protect masajid. Allah Most High has said in Surah Al-Hajj, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ بَعْدَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَهُدِّمَتْ صَوَامِعُ وَبِيعٌ وَصَلَوَاتٌ وَمَسَاجِدُ يُذْكَرُ فِيهَا اسْمُ اللَّهِ كَثِيرًا وَلَيَنْصُرَنَّ اللَّهُ مَن يَنْصُرُهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَقَوِيٌّ عَزِيزٌ. And if Allah had not ordained that some people should resist others, all monasteries, churches, synagogues, masajid, in all of which Allah's name is mentioned abundantly, would all have been destroyed. And Allah will most certainly help those who help His cause. For verily Allah is most powerful, almighty. Our audience would be happy to learn that the announcement that we will one day return Hagia Sophia to that Christian world which is led by Russia. This announcement may have already reaped wondrous results. The Russian foreign minister recently visited Pakistan with the equivalent of a blank check. The withdrawal of the United States forces from Saigon led to the collapse of South Vietnam. I do not expect that the withdrawal of the United States forces from Afghanistan would result in an immediate change or collapse of the government in Kabul. But the writing is on the wall, and the world can eventually expect a restoration of an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan some 20 years after the previous one collapsed in the aftermath of the 9/11 false flag attack on America. If an Islamic emirate is restored in Afghanistan, an opportunity would then present itself for Pakistan to try to conduct the affairs of state on the basis of truth rather than conventional political wisdom. An Islamic emirate that is guided by the Quran may perhaps learn from mistakes committed 25 years earlier. Hence, it would not seek membership in either United Nations organization or in the International Monetary Fund, and thus would have no legal obstacles preventing it from declaring the gold dinar and silver dirham as legal tender. When that happens, the government of Pakistan would find to its surprise it has run out of time and can no longer postpone the inevitable recognition of dinar and dirham as legal tender in this country as well. Once gold and silver coins are readily available in the market, the government of Pakistan should then take bold steps to remove the Zionist monetary rope around the neck, which has been around the neck for more than 70 years, and which has now been tightened to the extent that it seems to strangle it. Pakistan must declare, unilaterally so, that the moral law is the highest law, and there is no place for oppression in that law. The present interest payments on monetary loans, the present interest payments on loans negotiated by Zionist economic hitmen is oppressing the country and its people. Pakistan must declare that it will no longer pay interest on such loans, but it will pledge itself to repay the capital sum borrowed. Such payments, however, must be based on a timetable subject to Pakistan's capacity to repay. Finally, Pakistan must pledge itself, while still there is time to do so, to be faithful to absolute truth located in the Quran. The conduct of state must conform to that absolute truth. We accept that conformity with absolute truth does not at this time obtain in the conduct of state of this country. But a pledge must nevertheless be made to make the effort to achieve that objective. Of course, I direct this part of my address to that part of Pakistan which still longs to be faithful to the Quran. I am painfully aware that there are others who would protest to the angel Jibreel alayhi salam, who was sent by Allah Most High to inform Maryam alayhi salam that she would have a baby boy. Go back, they would declare, demand of the angel. Go back. She's still a child. Come back when she's 18 years of age. It will be a futile effort to address those whose notion of truth has come from a bogus secular scripture which has arrived by Federal Express from Bandarabad. Such people must not be allowed to prevent this country from returning in its conduct of state to truth that is located in the Quran. Pakistan's greatest assets are its abundant youth and children. And my Islamic eschatology indicates to me that they are in greater danger at this time in the historical process than ever before in human history. If proper steps are not immediately taken to protect them, this country will eventually reap a bitter harvest of a nation filled with automatons who will be bereft of the capacity to think and bereft of the capacity to choose. Rather, others will think for them, others will choose for them, and they will dance to every tune that is played for them. It's called brainwashing, and it is blatantly practiced on televisions around the world today, every day and every night, without even a fig leaf to cover its abominable shame. The first step on the road of depriving children in particular of their freedom, it seems to me to be the damage done to memory by the electromagnetic waves with which we are inundated since the emergence of the cellular phone and the internet. Parents who do not want to have to answer on Judgment Day for damage done to their children should make haste to find a place of residence where bees can still produce honey and where the smallest of birds can still fly. In addition, it is important that children recite the Quran every day so that the Quran can heal them of damage already done to their mind. My book entitled The Quran in the Moon, Methodology for Monthly Recitation of the Quran, has taught the way to recite the Quran in order that it can deliver shifa or healing, as well as protect from the dangers which now surround them. Allah Most High has declared in Surah Al-Isra, وَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ جَعَلْنَا بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ hijaban mastura. And whenever you recite the Quran, we place a hijab or an invisible barrier between you and those who do not believe in the life to come. Before I end, allow me to address a few words concerning the virus. The Muslim believes that all of creation was an act of a wise and loving God. He also believes that beneath the material, there is a spiritual reality. In Dr. Iqbal's inimitable phrase, a Muslim embraces a spiritual interpretation of the universe. It follows that nature is enveloped in truth and cannot therefore deliver an epidemic which would embrace all of mankind at the same time. Yet this virus seems to embrace every town and every city all over the world at the same time. The discerning believer would therefore easily recognize that this present virus did not come from nature. Rather, it's a case of biological warfare waged by the most evil of all people. I therefore do not trust their vaccine, and I will not take it. Indeed, this has to be the biological warfare prophesied by Nabi Muhammad ﷺ, which is designed to eventually wipe out the Arabs the way sheep die in a plague. But this world is a moral order. And hence, in the ominous words of Russian President Vladimir Putin, they will one day have to drink the poison which they brewed for others. Our Prophet ﷺ prophesied that they will one day be attacked, by a virus which will attack them at the top of the spine and which would paralyze them. And by the next morning, they'll all be dead. And praise is due to Allah, most just. And I thank you.